Good morning. This is Eric Dye. I appreciate the opportunity to come talk with you this morning, and I extend my welcome as well. This looks like a very exciting agenda, and I'm very sorry I'm not able to join you in person, but I do appreciate the opportunity that Melinda Matney has given me to address you for a few minutes. It's kind of interesting to try to think about how to make a welcoming address when I'm actually not there to welcome you. But the good thing is that on video, I can pretty much say whatever I want, and there's absolutely no way that Melinda can. Okay, all right. But I do appreciate the opportunity to talk with you this morning. It does look like an interesting agenda, but I want to raise a couple of questions about the conference theme, the symposium theme today, deconstructing theory into practice. It's kind of an interesting topic in a way because it really does point to one of the big problems we have, I think, in terms of moving forward practice, both in student affairs and higher education practice in general, which is how do we integrate research, empirical evidence, into a lot of the work that we're doing. The problem, I think, or the challenge is getting beyond the idea that when we have to deconstruct issues of theory, it looks something like this. It's not a wrecking ball issue, but it's a question of how do we connect ideas, theories, and actual practice. I think in reality that if we think about it, the true difference between practice and theory is probably not as big as we imagine it to be. I think part of this is it's a question of a masquerade. My own sense is that a lot of the issues that appear to be theoretical issues are fundamentally communication issues. Okay, I will confess, in the field of academia, quite often inscrutability seems to be considered an academic virtue. That is, being opaque, being hard to understand, sort of indicating perhaps you're smart. Well, that's sort of a defensive strategy, and one that really helps create a barrier between actual implementation of research practice, implementation of research into practice. It's kind of a problem, but the reality is I don't think, my argument at least is, it doesn't have to be that way. And I also need to make the point that inscrutability, the opposite thereof, is not dumbing things down. It's a matter of thinking through more fundamentally what the basic issue to be communicated is and going from there. What I think, higher education is a really interesting point right now. Basically a very interesting fork in the road that at one level we've got higher education faculty, faculty throughout colleges and universities regardless of their field, are starting to get more and more interested in issues of teaching. A lot of this I think most people see as well overdue, but basically it's a matter of trying to implement changes in people's teaching practices in such a way that we can actually improve the undergraduate learning experience. It's a very exciting time to be in higher education. On the other side of the fence, the other side of the fork, is I think the more holistic educational approach that I think intuitively, just as a matter of course, that student affairs practitioners have always been tremendously talented at, starting to move more into the more formal teaching role. So it's a matter of trying to figure out what the fork in the road is and which side we're going to take. My own concern is that just as the academic world, the faculty, the professoriate is starting to move towards more of a holistic, less regimented, less cognitively focused, let's say, emphasis in terms of their work, it may be that we, in student affairs and other fields of practice within higher education, make the mistake of copying the worst aspects of this. And I think the problem with that fork is that while we're actually looking for a little bit of Elvis, we might actually get a little Chirac. I think we need to be very careful about that. The traditional academic outlet has always been the written word. Increasingly, though, with technology as well as fast-moving organizations, it really has started to shift. The written reports are much less important than actually being able to communicate things in a presentation format that's really quite useful. I think this sort of incorporates new media understanding, new approaches to teaching and learning in ways that I think could be useful to student affairs practitioners and I think also faculty. But I think one of the issues that we have to struggle with is how do we organize presentations? It used to be that, in fact, in the written world, if that's the thing that we're working on, the manuscript-based world is such that there isn't too much separation. But I think if we think about presentations, there are a couple different elements we need to consider. One is, what is the content? It's true of any kind of written text as well. But we also need to see about what visual aids might be appropriate, and also think about the presenter performance. These things are much more simplified in a written kind of framework for communicating things, but need to be considered, I think, a little bit more explicitly when we start to talk about presentation formats. So when we think about a typical presentation, these things basically get smushed together. The idea of content, well, it's overlapping with visual aids and presenter performance. And I think we can demonstrate this in a couple of ways. One common expression of this confusing overlap is that people tend to put every word they are going to say on their PowerPoint slides. Although this eliminates the need to memorize one's talk, ultimately this makes your slides crowded, wordy, and boring as a visual aid. You have most likely finished reading this by now, so if I'm still speaking, I'm boring you if you are still participating in the presentation as a listener. How many people have seen slides like this? Yeah, universal. I don't need to wait for the count on that one. But it's, again, a confusion of these different elements. Let me give an example out of my own work. I was part of a team here at the University of Michigan that looked at affirmative action outcomes. And as part of that work, after we'd done the legal process, submitted our materials that eventually made it to the Supreme Court, we basically created we called it our dog and pony show, where we tried to create a standard set of PowerPoint slides that could be used in just about any kind of context. Mostly universities were interested in having people speak about this, but also public community, other kinds of groups were as well. So these are some of the slides we used. This is an example. So if we look at this, this is trying to talk about the types of evidence that had been developed previously to look at the impact of diversity on student outcomes. I'll give you a second to look through that. I was really proud of this slide when I first developed it, but when I look at it now, I'm a little bit embarrassed because I've confused the fact that, you know what, this is not a very good visual aid. It's a pretty good written summary that might appear in a report, and in fact did appear in our report, but that in fact it really does not work particularly well as a visual thing. Today, I would communicate this in a much more succinct manner, and it would look just like this. We've got a graphical representation of diversity. I'm telling you a little bit about the impact and the evidence of impact. And the interesting thing is this. Let me go back at the slide. Notice I have 4 different things listed here. There are, in fact, if you read that list, only 3 different things. I've even confused myself in terms of creating the PowerPoint slide. Imagine what the audience must have thought. So what I thought we'd do for the next few minutes is just look through a couple of different slides to talk about what kinds of things seem to work better in presentations, to give you some ideas as you go back and do your own work, things that might be useful. The best advice to think about this is when we're communicating things, we need to consider our audience. This is true of written work, but I think it's also especially true of presentation materials. What kinds of things are going to motivate the audience to actually stay connected? I think we also need to make sure that we can tell a good database story. This fundamentally comes down to issues of storytelling, but not anecdotes, database stories. And I think that's a very important distinction, but I think it really helps move forward the way we think about creating and making these presentations. And then finally, make sure that such stories, and I think they do inherently, connect theory and practice in meaningful ways. I think rather than thinking about the presentation as an add-on, it's got to be an integrated sort of approach. I also think that it's important, one other thing I think we all as academics and people who are trying to emulate academics spend a lot of time trying to be defensive and put way too much information in their materials. So I think we want to make sure we finish leaving the audience wanting a little bit more, because you really can come back for an encore. I can probably only do that if Melinda rewinds this video and shows it to you again, but you get my point. I hope you get my point. So again, thank you for your time. I think Melinda's going to have a few minutes here to do a little discussion, see whether or not there's some points raised in this presentation which you find useful, which I hope. And again, I apologize for not being able to join you, and I wish you a successful day as you move through the conference agenda.